David Henry, welcome to this brief interview. I'm happy you took the time to meet with us.
Thanks for inviting me, happy to share.
You've been involved in setting up a bank from scratch in Abu Dhabi, taking them through the licensing process. You're now working for a different company, UK based, entering the GCC market with a new bank again. What has that journey been like for you?
Fascinating. I mean, it's amazing having the privilege to be part of banking builds. I mean, there are so many people employed by banks globally. The opportunity to build them from scratch, it's a real privilege, and I'm very fortunate to be doing it a second time. It's also been quite different. This time around with Nomo, we're leveraging a license that's already held in the UK with the PRA, the FCA, in the form of BLME's banking license. It's amazing being able to see it from that different side of things, because rather than obviously going and everything from scratch, we're leveraging some capabilities that are already there, but it's a very new business. So it's still lots of different components of how does this fit into the existing balance sheet? What does this mean for the business, and how is it going to help achieve the vision of the shareholders?
And where do you see the opportunities in the banking sector in the GCC for a new actor to come in?
There's a lot of momentum building. I think if you look across the various GCC markets, there's lots of different names of either pure challenger banks seeking licensing themselves, like we've had in Dubai. You've also got different banking apps as well, so Yappa here as well, behind Bank, just layering different experiences on top. The market's a very interesting one on a remittance basis, obviously. There's I think Saudi and the UAE are the two largest local remittance players in the world, so we've also got Wise who've moved into the market as well in the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So there's lots of opportunity, I think, from a remittance play, but I think in general, helping the digitization agenda further forward. I think the region's doing a good job catching up. It was a bit behind, I think, in terms of Western Europe where they were. But that's what's great to see about these new players coming in. They're focused on experience-led design as opposed to just process products from an old school perspective.
Right. So at Várri Consultancy, we're getting quite a few questions from international companies within the financial services or fintech sectors who are looking at potentially entering the UAE market, the wider GCC market, or the Middle East, North Africa market. What advice would you give to them when they're going through this thought process?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. There's a lot of pre-work that needs to be done before a decision is taken. I mean, as much as the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, is there to help make this easier between the various Gulf states, there's still lots of harmonisation that needs to go on. So each jurisdiction does have its own. Obviously, with the UAE, you've got multiple free zones within. You've got similar setups in places like Bahrain, and whereas Saudi is more of an onshore market, and understanding how SAMA works from a financial services perspective is very important. So you've also got data protection considerations. If you want to come into the market, say you're in Western Europe and you're a cloud native application doing financial services. Right. In the Middle East, it's a key consideration is what are the data protection regulations regimes in those jurisdictions, because some are more friendly than others.
What's sort of the development in terms of cloud providers and where their hubs are based?
So Microsoft is set up here in the UAE, so if you want to use Azure, they're here, and AWS are over in Bahrain. But it's always interesting, and I think I've experienced that a couple of different times, where sometimes a provider or a company will look and say, oh, AWS are in Bahrain, that means I can serve the whole GCC out of that region. But again, that's not always going to be the case, because the data protection rules are there to protect locals in these markets, and sometimes the ability to host data even within the region is not necessarily appropriate.
And in which of these niche segments or specializations do you think there's a gap at the moment?
I always find identity verification, credit scoring really interesting, particularly in this region, because this region, in a lot of ways, we're actually really data rich with our central identity schemes in terms of the way that you and I have a card in our pocket that we can use to procure government services of all kinds. But at the same time, the credit data from a bureau perspective is not necessarily where it should be. So, and there's lots of initiatives underway to get on that, but I think there's lots of opportunity in markets in the GCC to capitalize on the centralization of information and knowledge to deliver more equitable outcomes from a lending perspective. And I think you and I are both expats in this country longer than me, but it's understanding more of how that works and how the local banks can actually understand more about me, given that I'm not, I haven't, unlike the UK where I had a bank account when I was 14, and you stay with it for a long period of time. Here I'm 3 years old to the banks here, right? And they don't know that much about me.
I think in this region there may be some quick wins. Why do you think these fintech companies that pop up in other markets stay there rather than going here and target these quick wins, as you mentioned, with credit scoring and credit bureaus as well?
Absolutely. I think it's an eternal paradox of the fundraising merry-go-round. You're out there looking for funds to expand. Do you consolidate and try and build a profitable base where you are, or do you look at the markets where you could grow rapid expansion and potentially grow top line at the expense of bottom line and keep riding the private equity wave? So the differences in this region and the approach, I think, sometimes can be a bit of a challenge for those that have maybe been more successful in more Western economies. So that's why I think the ability to partner with local firms, people who've been in the market, such as yourself and the work you're doing with Várri, I think it makes a huge difference. It is a different culture, a different environment, but it's not something they should be scared of. It's something that should be embraced.
If I meet you 2 years from now at the same conference, what do you think will have happened within the fintech sector in the GCC markets? How has it evolved 2 years from now?
That's a very good question. A lot of interesting movement within remittances. I think the payments landscape will be in interesting shape, and maybe global players that are coming into the market more aggressively. It may well be we have the regional players that already exist expanding further. I think that's going to be interesting. I think we'll have a lot more penetration from a digital banking perspective. You've got large incumbents in a lot of the countries, particularly Saudi Arabia is kind of on the precipice of having a lot more newer entrants into that market, or at least new brands from some of the existing banks focusing on that digital experience. We'll have, maybe the way to put it is, we'll have a lot more foundations in place that will enable some of those fintechs you're talking about from Western Europe that are doing more interesting niche things to come to this market and build on those foundations.